ultimately the miracle of Israel, and how that the fact that the nation is in the land today is what one commentator, Ron Rhodes, says is not only a trend of prophecy, it is a super trend of prophecy. And we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. But last time, as we were looking at this and kind of looking at the overview, we talked about the fact that when we talk about the timeline of prophetic events, right now we're living in the church age. At some point, and I don't think it's going to be too awful long, there's going to be the rapture of the church. After the rapture of the church, there's going to be a tribulation period of 7 years. In that 7 years, at the midpoint, a lot of stuff is going to happen. And that last 3.5 years, the Scripture refers to as the Great Tribulation. And as we told you last time, it's basically going to be hell on earth in that last 3.5 years. Then Christ comes back, the Battle of Armageddon, we come with him. And he establishes the millennial kingdom, which is a rule and reign of 1,000 years. And then after that 1,000 years, we have the creation of the new heaven and the new earth. And so we're going to be getting into all of those things in a lot more detail as we go forward. But as we talked about last time, we're going to be looking at, different parts and pieces of all of this so that when we look at it, we can kind of connect the dots as we go through. And one of the biggest prophetic events that Scripture talks about, specifically in the Old Testament, but we see shadowings of it in the New Testament as well, is the miracle of Israel. And you all know I'm a history buff. And Brother Sam even brought me a book on kind of pre-U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War based on his devotion the other night in the deacons meeting. And he said, this will be a good rainy day book. And I'm like, yo, buddy. So I'm looking forward to getting into it here soon. But when you study the history of Israel, you see a lot of things that you can't do anything but attribute it to the hand of God. Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 and 2 says this, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now Christ made that statement somewhere in and around AD 30. And he made that prophecy. And that prophecy came true in an absolutely amazing way 40 years later in AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. And as they destroyed Jerusalem, they also destroyed the temple. We have had the opportunity to not only see some of that from the standpoint of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, but we had the opportunity, probably one of my favorite places to visit in Israel that is not a biblical site per se, is the desert fortress of Masada. And at the desert fortress of Masada, that was one of the last holdouts outside of Jerusalem. And if I could take the time to get into the stuff that happened at Masada, you could understand even more of what happened in Jerusalem. But the Romans used captive Jews to build the ramps necessary, the earthen ramps necessary to allow the Romans to overrun the fortress at Masada. When the Romans tried to build the earthen ramps themselves, the Jews up there had plenty of great big rocks at the top of the mountain, and they'd throw them off and knock all the soldiers and the construction workers off and kill them. So they brought slave labor in, Jewish slave labor in from all over the land, and used them to build the earthen ramps because they knew the Jews would not kill their own people. And so there's a tremendous story. I had the privilege the last time I was there, that's been a long time now, but the last time that I was there, the guide gave me the speech that the Jewish leader there gave to the people. And he said, I want you to read this to everybody. It wasn't a very long speech, but it would absolutely, I'm sitting here talking to you about it, and if you could see the chills running up and down my arms right now, it's absolutely an amazing thing. But Jerusalem faced an incredible siege. And in that siege, there came a point to where the city was actually overrun by the Romans. I'm going to show you some pictures and show you some quotes as we go through this. Josephus was a Jewish historian. He was actually a religious Jew, but he kind of could tell where things were going, and he offered his services to the Roman leadership to let them know who these people were, that all of this had happened. So he kind of became the historian. And if you've ever seen his book, it's called Josephus, his Antiquities and the Wars of the Jews and all of those kind of things. And you can get them online, or you can buy the books. It really is a very good historical account of the Jewish nation all the way back from creation. And you get the 400 silent years that we've talked about and a lot of other stuff that's a part of that. But he also talks a great deal about what happened during the siege. And this is just some of his account. These Romans put the Jews to flight and proceeded as far as the holy house itself, talking about the temple. At which time one of the soldiers, without staying or waiting on any orders, and without any concern or dread upon him at so great an undertaking, and being hurried on by a certain divine fury, snatched somewhat out of the materials that were on fire, and being lifted up by another soldier, he set fire to a golden window, through which there was a passage to the rooms that were round about the holy house on the north side of it. As the flames went upward, the Jews made a great clamor, such as so mighty an affliction required, and ran together to prevent it. And now they spared not their lives any longer, nor suffered anything to restrain their force, since that holy house was perishing. Thus it was the holy house burnt down, nor can one imagine anything greater or more terrible than this noise. For there was at once a shout of the Roman legions who were marching all together, and a sad clamor of the seditious, those Jews who were trying to stop them, who were now surrounded with fire and sword. The people, under a great consternation, made sad moans at the calamity they were under. Yet was the misery itself more terrible than this disorder, for one would have thought that the hill itself on which the temple stood was seething hot, as full of fire on every part of it. The temple itself was so engulfed in flames, and this is... I've done everything I can to verify that this is historical fact. I cannot find anything that specifies this is what happened, but it does make sense given what Josephus says here. Is that the temple itself, Herod's temple that stood there at that time, was an amazing building. It was even said by people at that time that anyone who had not seen the temple of Herod had never seen a magnificent building. It was a tremendous edifice, but there was a lot of gold inside it with the instruments, and also outside it in the adornment and all of the things that was there. And as you know, gold burns at melts at a fairly low temperature considering most metals. And the fire was so hot, given the amount of destruction, the fire was so hot that it easily could have melted the gold that was a part of the temple. And because of that, it's a legend. I can't verify it, but there is a legend that where the gold melted down into the cracks, where they didn't use mortar in between the blocks, that the gold would melt in between the blocks and cool, and the Roman soldiers would move the blocks in the rock to try to scrape up the gold. And that's why that prophecy says that there will not be one stone left upon another. The reason that happened was because they were breaking the rocks apart, moving the stones, trying to get to the gold that had melted in between the cracks. Now, again, it makes perfect sense that would have happened, but I can't 100% verify that anywhere. The earliest reference that I can find is to a Ray Stedman, and he talks about it, but he doesn't reference where he gets it. And then I found a couple other kind of doing some research on it, found a couple other things, and they tie it back to Josephus, but this is the account. And Josephus doesn't say that specifically. He just says the whole mountain was on fire, which would have lent to the gold being melted, obviously. So, again, whether that's exactly what happened or not, the temple, all of Jerusalem, was basically destroyed as a part of that Roman siege in AD 70. This is the Arch of Titus. This was actually built in Rome. We saw this on our trip to Rome. We didn't get close to it, but we did see it. Titus was the Roman general who was responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem. And when he came back, they rewarded him with what was called a Roman triumph. and that was just a big parade in the city for his service to the empire. And they also built this arch that's here. It's called the Arch of Triumph. And inside of that, right here, in this section of the arch, you see this image. And it's the Roman soldiers marching out with some of the instruments from the temple. Right here, you see 2 silver horns on a stand. And then what I've got circled right here is the Jewish menorah, the candlestick that would have been in the temple. And so we know that the Romans took a lot of the valuables out of the temple even before this destruction itself. There's all kinds of debate on what all they took. And there is even some discussion on occasion about Israel petitioning the church, the Catholic Church, because they've got all this stuff, about trying to get some of it back. Now, we've been, like I said, to Israel on 3 different occasions, and at that time we saw the actual mold that they used. At that time they were going to use it, but it was the mold that they were going to use to create the new menorah. And it's an amazing process how they were going to basically do it. But it was a wax mold, and it was going to be all of one piece of gold, and they were going to use liquid gold to form around the wax, and then the wax itself would melt, leaving it hollow on the inside so they could fill it with oil for the lamps. It's incredible technology, some of the stuff that we saw there, but it looks almost identical to the one that you see in that arch. They built it in, and as a matter of fact, they actually have those silver trumpets on the stand that's in that picture. They actually have those already built and have been built for a long time. I got pictures of them. I meant to bring my book tonight, and I forgot them. But this is the only part of the Temple Mount that really is part of the original Temple Mount at the time of the Jewish destruction. This wall is what you often hear referred to as either the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, okay? And what you see down here is obviously groups and groups and groups of Jewish people and even tourists. I've been right down there to where you see all these folks. There's a ladies section. They keep them separate. And there's a ladies section about right here. And the ladies can go down to the wall on this side where the court of the women would have been when the temple was there. But this wall is actually not part of the temple, but it is a retaining wall that was built to support the structure for the temple. Okay, but this is the only thing that's even left of the original structure. The green plants that you see hanging off of that, you would think that the Jews would have such a reverence for this wall, which they do, that they would get that weed off the wall. That weed is hyssop that started growing there on its own. And hyssop is used and when they build the temple, it will be hyssop that is used in the purification process. So for them to see hyssop growing out of the retaining wall, the only thing that's left of the original temple, that is a sign that God's on the move, and they're not going to touch it. If you notice right there at the back end of it, you see that opening. We've been inside there and actually traveled down into the city. There's a prophecy that when the temple is rebuilt and Christ comes back during the millennium, that fresh water will run from under Temple Mount all the way down to the Dead Sea, and there will be fishing again at En-Gedi. And En-Gedi is one of the cities on the Dead Sea, and there's nothing in the Dead Sea but high concentrations of salt. And but the last trip we took, we were walking down through there, and we got about halfway through, and we got to a point which was pretty close to about where the Holy of Holies would have been. And there were some people there praying and some other stuff, and we just kind of kept walking. Well, we kept walking, and we got to a point to where I started hearing dripping water. And I'm like, well, that's kind of strange. And we kept walking, and we kept walking, and then all of a sudden, we started walking on plexiglass. And we're looking down on water that's coming out of the wall. They don't know where it's coming from. They don't know why it's there. The Palestinians accused the Jews of trying to flood the Palestinian quarter with it, and the Jews have accused the Palestinians of trying to flood the Temple Mount to keep them out. Neither one of them takes credit for it. Neither one of them's real sure exactly what's going on. But just the other day, there was an earthquake right near Temple Mount, right where all of this stuff is going on. So it's getting exciting. That's just all I'll say. It's getting exciting. But we've actually been there and seen the water that it's very likely talking about that one day will actually flow from Jerusalem all the way down to the Dead Sea. So that's, like I said, I could stay on this stuff. We'd be here forever. I'm going to try my best to get through some of this tonight. The timeline of Israel, as you look at it from the destruction to current day, this is what we see. 70 AD, the temple and the city were destroyed by the Romans. In 135 AD, Jerusalem was razed to the ground again because of what's known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. Bar Kokhba called himself the Messiah. And he got some of the religious leaders to back him because they were looking to overthrow Rome, and they knew that if they had the Messiah that they thought they were looking for, that the people would rally around him and they'd be able to overthrow the yoke of Rome. And instead, he was defeated, and when he was defeated, of course, the religious leaders said, well, we were wrong, it wasn't him. And the Romans once again destroyed Jerusalem, what was left of it, and burned it to the ground. As a matter of fact, they renamed the city Aeolius Capitolina as a result, to even mark out any idea that the Jews ever at any time had anything to do with Temple Mount and the nation or the city of Jerusalem. From 135 to about 324, it just laid waste. Nothing went on. The Jews were scattered all through the world. And the city just kind of laid there in waste. In 324 to 638 AD, the city and what was Palestine was under Byzantine control. The Byzantines was after the Roman Empire split, for lack of a better way of saying it, it split into the Holy Roman Empire and the Old Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire had control of Jerusalem at that time. It was still under Roman control. From 638 to 1099, Jerusalem was under Muslim control. 1099 to 1187 is the Crusades. The city changed hands several times over that time period. Part of the time it was under Christian control. Part of the time it was still under Muslim control. But that was from 1099 to 1187. 1250 to 1517, it was the Mamelukes, or what they call the Mameluke period. And the Mamelukes are an interesting group. They were basically Russian and Eastern European mercenaries. They were slaves, but then they were also soldiers. And at one point, they kind of overthrew everybody for a period of time. It's an interesting part of the history. But for a period of time, they actually controlled Jerusalem and part of what's known as Israel today, from 1250 to about 1517 AD. 1517 to 1917, so we're talking about a 400-year time period, it was under the Ottoman Turks. Now, it's still, if you go back to the Muslim control in 638, all the way to 1917 AD, for the most part, Jerusalem and the land of Israel was under Muslim control. There were a few years, through the Crusader years, that the Christians had it, but they never were able to keep it for very long. And the sad thing about it is that the Christians actually killed more Jews who were still trying to live in and around the area of Jerusalem during this time than even the Muslims did. Because the Catholic Church had taught with pretty much a great deal of success, and it followed even Martin Luther in the Reformation and everything else, that the Jews were the ones who killed Christ. So because of that, even when the Christians had control of Jerusalem and those parts of Israel, they would kill the Jews or torture the Jews in basically retaliation for killing Christ. But during that period of time, from the 600s to 1917, it was pretty much under Muslim control. At this particular time, 1517 to 1917 was the Ottoman Turk period. That's when things like the Dome of the Rock and some of those things were, and Al-Aqsa Mosque, and some of those things were beginning to be built. They were added onto over time. and to some of the wonderful, as far as beautiful structures that you see today. But they started during this Ottoman Turk period from 1517 to 1917. Again, the Jews have been scattered throughout the world at this time. There are very, very few Jews in Israel, and especially in and around Jerusalem because of the threats to their lives and everything else. So it was pretty much under the control of the Muslims during this time. 1896. Now, here's what you also have to understand. How many of you knew that, how many of you have heard of the Black Plague that ravaged Europe? How many of you knew that the Jews were blamed for the Black Plague? Not nearly as many. Why were they blamed? This is why they were blamed, believe it or not. Because they kept the Jewish laws of cleanliness. They never allowed things. The reason that the Black Plague spread like it did was unsanitary conditions. Well, the Jews, they lived in pockets to themselves, and they kept the sanitary laws that you find in the book of Leviticus, so they were never really impacted by the Black Plague. And because they weren't impacted, guess who got the blame? And so throughout the Jewish history, and I encourage you, if you really want to get into some of this, there's a book called Exploring the World of the Jews by John Phillips. You cannot buy this new anymore. You have to find it on Amazon. I've had it for years. I had it when you could still get it used or get it new. But you can get that. It'll give you all the history, a lot of interesting stuff about that. Another good book that deals with it, and this is new, brand new, it's been out about a year. It's called The Miracle of Israel. And it tells you a lot about stuff that happened to the nation of Israel in the years that they were outside of the land and even since they've come back. This is a great little book. It's not a hard read either, as you can tell. But it's got a lot of good information in it. But anyway, 1896, the Jews prior to that in the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, and even before that were constantly being persecuted for one reason or another. Because they were odd, because they wouldn't do things like everybody else, because somehow they didn't get sick when everybody else got sick, whatever the reasoning was. And so they were constantly under attack. And in 1896, Theodore Herzl, a Jew, published a book called The State of the Jews. And basically what he said in 1896 was the only way that Israel will be able to live outside of being persecuted is if they have their own land again. So this was the book that started what's called the modern Zionist movement. And it was Theodore Herzl, and there was a lot of other, Chaim Weizmann and several other that were involved with it. But this was the book that kind of got the modern day period started, okay? Now, 1916, remember the date, 1517 to 1917, it was under Ottoman Turk period, or control. 1916, there was an agreement. This is World War I. The Ottoman Turks had sided with the enemies, had sided with Germany. And so Europe, or Great Britain, and France were fighting Germany and the Austrians and the folks that were involved in all of that. The Turks had kind of thrown their lot in with the Germans. And so Great Britain and France were looking at this going, you know, once we win this war, if we win it, we're going to have to deal with the Ottoman Turks. And so, how many of you have ever heard of Lawrence of Arabia? This is it. Lawrence of Arabia was this right here. Okay? Lawrence of Arabia and some others worked with the Ottoman Turks. Or the Arabs, I'll say more than the Ottoman Turks, but they worked with the Arabs in what's now considered the Middle East. Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt and those kind of countries. And they basically said, you know, when we defeat Germany and the Ottoman Turks, we've got to make sure we get control of the Mediterranean. And so two men, one charged from Great Britain, one charged from France, Sykes from Europe, or from Great Britain, Picot from France. They worked out an agreement, and they drew it out on a map. And you have to understand that prior to Sykes-Picot, there was no Jordan. There was no Iraq. There was no Iran. There was no Syria. There was no Lebanon. There was Turkey and Persia and Arabia and Egypt. So Sykes-Picot was the agreement that basically created most of the modern states that we have in that area today. Now, there were all kinds of reasons why they did it. One, the French and the British wanted control of large sections of the Mediterranean. Another reason they did it was they did not want, because Europe was going to be so devastated because of the war, they did not want the Arabs to see it as another chance to come back into Europe. So what they did was they worked out agreements, and again, there's a lot of history here. I could get into this. We'd be here all night. but they basically created these substates. And they put people in charge of those substates who hated each other. And by doing that, they spent more time fighting each other, and they wouldn't have time to unite to come against them. And that's where the modern Middle East conflict comes from. As a matter of fact, I have a video. How many of you have heard of ISIS and ISIL? I have a video of an ISIS leader saying, and this was when they were fighting in Syria, he stood on a sign that they had taken down, and he said, "We are here to destroy Sykes-Picot, to unite the Arabs under one flag again, under the caliphate." So everything that's happening, even up to modern day, ties back to 1916 and Sykes-Picot. Isn't that crazy? Oh, I'm telling you, like I said, I'm a history buff. We could have all kinds of fun. But 1916, Sykes-Picot. They split up the Middle East. They even had a section called Palestine, and that Palestinian section was the only part, and that's what is basically today modern Israel. And that section was called Palestine, and it was also under international jurisdiction, not just the British or not just the French. Now, after a while, the French looked at it and said, "You can have it if you want to," because it was nothing. It was swampland. It was basically rubble. It was desert, or it wasn't marsh. And so a lot of negotiating. The British ended up with it, and you'll read about things in history called the British Mandate. In other words, the British had control of this particular part of the area. The British Mandate ran out in 1948, the same year that Israel declared itself a nation. As a matter of fact, the day after the British Mandate was when Israel declared themselves a state. But we'll get more into that here in just a second. On 11/2/1917, about a year after Sykes-Picot, the British government released what's called the Balfour Declaration. And in that Balfour Declaration, they said this: "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." In other words, the UK said the Crown supports the creation of a Jewish state in 1917. As long as the Jews, if they go back, don't try to destroy anybody else. So this happens in 1917. All right, the Balfour Declaration. Now, of course, we know that, well, and I'll show you the numbers here in just a second, that even back to the time of Herzl, Jews began to move their way back to Israel. Okay, a little bit at a time. But we know that it was the event of the Holocaust that led to the creation of the Jewish state, because of the horrendous events and basically the shame of the world. The UN and everybody else said, okay, the Jews need their home. We're going to let them establish it. The British Mandate ran out in May of 1948, and the day after that mandate ran out, that's when the Jews declared themselves an independent nation once again. Great book on that and the history and the machinations. And if you're interested in politics, there's a little book called Nations United. And it shows you how it's interesting too. Remember me talking about how that Sykes-Picot was put in place to kind of keep the Arabs fighting each other so they wouldn't try to take over Europe because Europe was so badly beaten? One of the reasons they wanted to get Israel back into the land when they did was because they knew that would make Israel the rallying point for the rest of the Arab nations, and Europe would not have to worry about the Arab nations again while they rebuilt after a world war. Like I said, we can get into all kinds of stuff. But anyway, to give you a little bit of the numbers. 1882 to 1903, 35,000 Russians began migration into Israel. 1904 to 1924, another 40,000. 1919 to 1923, this was beginning to happen in Eastern Europe when the Nazis were coming to power. The Jews kind of saw the handwriting on the wall, and they began to try to get out of the countries. And a lot of them ended up going back to Israel, and they came out of Eastern Europe, 40,000. 1924, 1929, 82,000. Most of which came out of Poland, again, because of the rise of Nazism. 1929 to 1939, Central Europe. Look at that number. 250,000. The Nazis. 1933 to 1948, another 110,000. And then ever how many of them moved back after World War II? There's not a real good number right there. 1948 to 1951, 687,000 migrated back. 1952 to 1960, 297,000 moved back. 1961 to 71, another 297,000. 1972 to 1979, 267,580. 1980 to 1989, 154,000. 1990 to 2001, 1 million. Now notice the difference. Starting in 1948 with the establishment of Israel as a nation, that they didn't just come out of Eastern Europe. The Jews were coming from everywhere in the world. That's important, and I'll show you why in just a minute. 2002, 2010, another 181,233 odd immigrated in. Now, of course, we know during that time some were dying and some would come and say it was too hard and they'd leave, but this was the numbers that were going in those rough half decades to decades. This was the headline on April the 16th, 2018 in the Times of Israel. This is a newspaper, a Jewish newspaper that I look at about every day. This was the headline on April 16th. At 70, Israel being 70 years old, May 14th, Israel's population is 8.8 million people, 43% of the world's Jews. In May, they became the single largest population of Jews in any country in the world. Up until then, it had been the U.S. But in the same month that they became 70 years old, they became the largest single population of Jews anywhere else in the world. Now, that's a lot of fascinating history. So what's that got to do with anything? Especially from a prophecy standpoint. Prophecies about the future. Well, many last days prophecies are tied to the Jews being in Israel. Remember, they were completely scattered across the world after 70 AD. So any prophecy that talks about the last days and it talks about Israel being back in the land means Israel's got to be there. For 2,000 years, they weren't there. Almost 2,000 years. And then suddenly in 1948, Israel went from being no nation to being a nation. And the population begins to explode. Many of the last days prophecies specifically reference a return to the land from all the nations of the world. Again, Israel had been taken captive several times, but they'd only been taken by a single empire or a single kingdom. So the prophecies that talk about Israel coming from all the different parts of the land had to be a future prophecy. And like I said, you go back, world, number after number after number, starting in 1948. Some last days prophecies are tied specifically to there being a temple and temple worship being restored in Israel. And that's not been the case since the temple was destroyed in AD 70. So these last days prophecies that you read about in the Old Testament and the New Testament are indications that we've had for 2,000 years that one day Israel would be back in their land. And since 1948, we've been the ones to live to see it. Now, some of those prophecies you find in Ezekiel, Daniel, I don't know how they got out of whack, but Ezekiel 36, Ezekiel 37, Ezekiel 38 and 39 is the Battle of Gog and Magog 1 that I told you about, like World War I, World War II. That's Battle of Gog and Magog 1. We'll talk about that one in detail. Daniel 9:27 talks about them being in the land and the temple being established. Matthew 24, which we'll read here in just a few minutes. But I want to take just a second and read Ezekiel. Let's read Ezekiel 36 because I want you to see these. Ezekiel 36, verse number 10. And I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel, even all of it. And the cities shall be inhabited, and the wastes shall be builded. Then in verse number 24. For I will take you from among the heathen, and gather you out of all countries, and will bring you into your own land. 1948. Why is that important? Well, I'll show you here in just a minute. But go over to Ezekiel 37. This is the prophecy that God gave Ezekiel of the land of the valley of the dry bones. And this is fascinating from the regathering of Israel standpoint. Listen to what it says. The hand of the Lord was upon me and carried me out into the spirit of the Lord and set me down in the midst of the valley which was full of bones, and caused me to pass by them round about. And behold, there were very many in the open valley, and lo, they were very dry. And he said unto me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord God, thou knowest. Again he said unto me, Prophesy upon these bones, and say unto them, O ye dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord God unto these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and ye shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and ye shall live, and ye shall know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied, there was a noise, and behold, a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to his bone. And when I beheld, lo, the sinews and the flesh came up upon them, and the skin covered them above, but there was no breath in them. Then said he unto me, Prophesy unto the wind, Prophesy, son of man, and say to the wind, Thus saith the Lord God, Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came unto them, and they lived and stood up upon their feet, an exceeding great army. Then he said unto me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, Our bones are dried, and our hope is lost. We are cut off for our parts. Therefore prophesy and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, O my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves and bring you into the land of Israel. And ye shall know that I am the Lord, when I have opened your graves, O my people, and brought you up out of your graves, and shall put my spirit in you, and ye shall live, and I shall place you in your own land. Then ye shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken it and performed it, saith the Lord. If you notice that, it says there's a process. There's bones, then the sinews, then the flesh, then the breath. It's talking about a gradual rebuilding of the nation. And again, that's the gradual rebuilding to today. We're seeing that prophecy take hold. Now, go with me to Matthew 24. And I'm trying to hurry here, but I want to show you this. Matthew 24. Verses 15 and 16. This is talking about the tribulation when the Antichrist sets himself up to be worshipped as God at the midpoint of the tribulation that we've talked about. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee unto the mountains. Now, there's a lot about this, but here's the key thing I want you to take away. Christ says here that the Antichrist will establish himself in the temple during the tribulation. There is no temple in Israel, but they are avidly working to get it done. They're remaking all the instruments. As a matter of fact, they have the instruments made. They've even flown Jews in from around the world to have them fitted for their priests' garments. I've seen them. And I get an email about once a month from a dear Jewish man who I wish would come to Christ. His name is Gershon Solomon. And he's part of the Temple Mount Faithful. And I've got pictures, and I'll show you. I didn't have time to look for them to show you one tonight, but we'll have them when we talk about some of the other things. They have the cornerstones of the new temple built. Unhewn stones. And I've got a picture standing in front of one of them, me. Standing in front of one of them. And so I'll bring you the pictures and you can see that. But they're preparing. They're ready. When I was there, I was talking to one of he's actually a Pharisee. He is actually on the new Sanhedrin. And he is one of the men responsible for the Institute of the Temple Treasures, where they're remaking all the instruments. Had an opportunity to talk to him on a couple of different Israel trips. I've got a couple of his books. And we got into a big discussion about the Ark of the Covenant. And he basically said, contrary to Hollywood, the Ark of the Covenant is not lost. He said, we know where it is, and we've always known where it is. And so, me being me, I looked at him and I said, have you seen it? He said, no. I said, do you know anybody who has? He said, yes. And then I said, where is it? Now, you have to understand that right before we got there, they had moved the Institute across the street, basically, to another building. And in the middle of the floor of this particular building, there was a big, like a well, that had a lock at the bottom of it. And anybody, if you've ever been to Israel, you know, if you go down layers, you're going back in time. And so this was dropping down to somewhere below street level at the time of Christ. So it's pretty well down in there. And we're standing there, and I said, where is it? And he looked at me, and this was his exact words. We're standing within a few meters of it. And I'm standing right next to that big hole. Oh, yeah, I had chill bumps running up and down and all the way around. And I said, how long would it take you if you had Temple Mount tomorrow? I said, how long would it take you before you'd be worshiping in the temple? And he said, they put up the majority of a skyscraper in 6 months. They're ready. They've got everything there. The instruments are there. The priest garments are there. The cornerstones are there. They're ready. And so when we talk about what happens at the Battle of Gog and Magog and what I think the trigger event is and all that kind of stuff, what you're going to see laid out is it won't take long before there's a temple in Israel. My personal opinion, and I'll show you this from Scripture when we get there, when it talks about the Antichrist signing a covenant with Israel, for years it's always been said to be a peace treaty. No, I don't think so. I'll show you what I think it is when we get there. Well, my personal opinion is I think that covenant says you can go worship again on Temple Mount. Because the Antichrist is the one who kind of spearheads that, and who is it at the midpoint that sets himself up as God in the temple? Does that make sense? I'll show you the Scriptures, back up some of that later. but I think that's kind of what happens there. And so from the time the Antichrist and they sign this covenant, Chaim Richmond looks at me and goes, oh, we could have the thing up in 6 months and be using it. So it won't take long. And that was many, many years ago. It'd probably take them half that time now. Christ said this. Randall Price said this: the modern return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel has been called the miracle on the Mediterranean. Such a return by a people group that's been scattered among the nations is unprecedented in history. Indeed, the Jewish people are the only exiled people to remain a distinct people despite being dispersed to more than 70 different countries for more than 20 centuries. The mighty empires of Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome all ravaged their land, took their people captive, and scattered them throughout the earth. Even after this, they suffered persecution, pogrom, and holocaust in the lands to which they were exiled, and yet all of these ancient kingdoms have turned to dust, and their former glories remain only as museum relics, and many of the nations that oppose the Jews have suffered economic, political, or religious decline. But the Jewish people, whom they have enslaved and tried to eradicate, live free and have again become a strong nation. And I say amen. But Christ said this: now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. That image of the fig tree is the image of Israel. And Christ said, when you see the leaves on the tree, when the nation is reborn, that the generation that sees that will not pass away till all the other events take place. Israel is 70 years old. We have people who were born in the same year that Israel became a nation. And the Bible says that that generation, born in 1948 or wherever, down the stream, would not pass away. The last member of that generation would not pass away until everything else came to pass. So you don't think we're close? It's been 70 years. We're getting close. And we'll talk about how close with some of the other things as we continue to move through this study. Father, I love you and I thank you and I praise you so much for the patience of the folks as we got into this tonight. Father, I pray that you'd just use it to encourage our hearts and excite us about what's coming. Father, not date setting. We don't know what day. The rapture could happen right now. But Father, how we